Hi and welcome to MhM Media Reacts. I'm Chris McDonald. I'm joined by Kev Allen.
Hey.
And today we're going to be talking about one of the biggest showings at E3, Zelda Breath of the Wild. So from what we saw, the game has got a very new direction for Zelda. There's a lot of changes, a lot of staples removed, quite drastic departure in a lot of aspects in terms of weapons, clothing, how the world is, how health works, how physics-based the game is, everything. It's quite a departure from everything we've seen before. How did you feel about that, Kev?
Yeah, you're definitely right. You're not understating that at all, how much of a departure this is. But on the whole, I feel very optimistic having seen it at E3 and what they showed. I think that so far it's off to a great start.
Yeah, I agree. And this new direction that we're seeing definitely isn't an accident. When Anuma was there presenting the game, he was very keen to talk about how much they sat down and set out to create a different experience and throw out the door a lot of the staples of the franchise. One of the things that is most standout with this new direction is how much technology suddenly seems to be in the world of Zelda. Even when you have the opening sequence of Link waking up, he's waking up in an almost technological fantasy type room that's sort of got computers, and it could almost be assumed to be some kind of like cryo suspension bed or some other suspended animation form. We don't know, but it was sort of giving those vibes. And even out in the field, he has like a PDA assistant that he can use to scan things and mark enemies and well, not mark, but get information on edges and bring up stats and such things, which is very out there for Zelda and not like what we've seen. And even beyond that, the game, much more than any Zelda in the past, is extremely physics-based. From every angle, there was that shot we got of him cutting down a tree in the trailer that a lot of people thought was just going to be a set piece, but then when you get into the game, you see that you can cut trees down from any angle, and that really impacts it. And even when they were showing the gameplay, they made a point of showing that you can cut the tree down at an angle that it won't bridge that gap. And a lot of the new items that we're seeing even play with the physics-basedness. We saw a dungeon item that stops time. That on its own is not something I don't think we'd quite seen that for Zelda. Zelda's played a bit with time-based dungeons in Skyward and stuff, but I'm not sure we saw an item that just stops time in a very localized area before. But what was quite cool is they took that and expanded it with the physics, where you can actually pack a lot of momentum into it while time's frozen, and then it will spring off and react, and whatever it bounces off, I guess. Yeah. Which was quite unusual for Zelda, and I do wonder what that's going to mean for dungeons and puzzles down the line. What was your thoughts on that, Kev?
Yeah, I love that. I really love the emphasis on variety and the ability to be doing things in the way that you want to do them, as you mentioned with the trees, that really you can screw that up, I guess, and then it's up to you to find another way to get around that situation. One thing that really hammered home how different this is for Zelda for me was the amount of new systems that were on display. You had a stamina bar for running and for climbing that functioned into how you were going to maneuver, how you would get around certain objects. When you're climbing, you're having to constantly keep the stamina bar in mind. You have to pay attention to that. The degradable equipment that swords can break, you can take swords from enemies. You can use more than just swords now. They had spears and stuff, which was cool. The sound wave bar that you have on screen, I thought was cool because it's a reminder that stealth is much more of a factor in this game than any Zelda that came before. You can actually sneak up on enemies in a much more useful way than before. It seems to be something that's a viable option if you want to get around enemy encounters that way rather than meeting them head on. I thought that was really cool.
Yeah, I agree. And they were keen to stress while they were demoing the game how much freedom of approaching situations was a big design factor in this game. We saw a lot of enemy outposts spread throughout this massive overworld, and one thing they did show that you can run in all guns blazing if you want, but as you picked on the stealth, that's also a viable option. And stealth hasn't been completely absent from the Zelda franchise, but it's always been set sections it's a factor in, and you have to stealth during these sections and you can't stealth during other sections, and they were always very basic and very simple. Whereas in this game, stealth seems to be just an optional tool that's available to you, much as anything else is, and it's up to you as a player how much you want to play stealthily or not. And talking about options and variety, that's something that we've not seen a lot of how the dungeons and puzzles are going to work, but even in what we saw at the E3 demo, we were seeing that there's multiple ways to solve puzzles now, whereas there wasn't before with Zelda games. Very occasionally there was a way to get around the intended way to solve it, but it was getting around the intended way to solve it usually, and it was often rare that it'd be an option. Whereas now, there's kind of the solution to the puzzle, but how you go about getting that solution to happen is up to you. One of the ones I saw was there was a barrier they had to burn past, and rather than just pulling at a stick, lighting on fire and running up to it as you often would, they actually set a lot of the grass on fire, cut it down, and there was wind blowing about the time that blew the grass into the actual barrier, and then that burned it down, whereas all the effects were just stacking together to allow them to solve it that way, instead of having to pull out the staff and burn it down. So we are definitely seeing, you know, option is a big factor in this game. One other thing I do want to talk about in terms of a lot of new system and stuff is the temperature system, and how clothing seems to be playing into that. That was very interesting. We're seeing that in this world, different environments will impact you differently, and you will have to respond accordingly. When Link moves into a cold environment, and if he's not wearing warm enough clothes, he is going to start to lose health from being there for a long period of times, and you're either going to need to use fire as a heat source to keep you warm, or cook foods that will warm you up for a temporary period of time if you don't have the clothing to see you through that environment, which again shows that there's multiple ways to tackle being in that environment. And also it's interesting that environments affect you in that way. We'd seen a little bit of that before in Ocarina of Time and such, where you walk into the volcano, and if you don't have the fire tunic, then you can't really progress, but it is nowhere near sophisticated as what we're seeing here. What was your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I loved it. Again, just this sort of stress that Nintendo's putting on variety and options. I loved it. One thing you touched on was the cooking system, which I do think is really cool, but it's one of the elements that did hammer home to me how different this Zelda is going to be, because gone is the classic, you know, picking up the little floating hearts. When you open chests now, it's just a standard sort of opening of the chest. There's not the classic music and Link holding the item up above his head. It's just one of those things that I wrestled with for a while, but I'm gradually coming to terms with it. And I think that the classic Zelda identity is still there. It's just that at times it'll be reserved for the bigger moments, but thankfully it does still feel like a Zelda game.
And on that subject of the bigger moments, having such things as degradable weapons that seem to be very expendable, as far as we've seen, there doesn't seem to be a way to repair these weapons, but they seem so plentiful that seems to be the point, that you are just going to be moving from weapon to weapon as you go. And obviously the clothing system is very suited by what's suited to your environment. So it does call into question, what does it mean when we get to the bigger moments? We know the Master Sword is going to be a factor in the game. One would assume, obviously, the iconic green tunic will be a factor in the game. And it makes you wonder, what is that going to mean for these items? Are we going to see something similar to what happened with the degradable shields we had in Skyward Sword, where the Hylian shield is there in the game that you can get later on if you work for it, and that's immune to sort of the degrading system? Or do they have something else in mind? What does that mean for these old staples?
Yeah, I mean, it is going to be interesting to follow that going forward. And among those questions, I also wonder if, with the stress on options and variety, will that carry over into boss fights as well? Because we haven't really seen boss fights yet. There was a quick flash of what appeared to be a boss, I remember, in the trailer, but I just wonder if that'll carry over. Maybe that'll factor in as well.
Yeah, and that would be quite interesting to see. And Nintendo were stressing during the E3 demo that they would even surprise themselves by a lot of the ways people were finding to play these games. So I wouldn't be surprised if that's a factor all throughout the game, that there is just these other ways to find to go about it other than what was the intended design route. although while we're talking about all the ways it's changed, this game interestingly does have a lot of callbacks, specifically to the original Legend of Zelda game on the NES. One of the things that they wanted to capture it with is you just waking up alone at the start of the quest and just venture out into the world with no information. And then very early in your quest, you meet this old man. Now, we heard a lot of rumours about the idea of it being a remake of the original, and even at E3, Nintendo were being quite coy about that and teasing the idea, but they were outright acknowledging that the callbacks were there to the original Legend of Zelda, and that was by no means an accident, and that they did want to... Miyamoto was saying that there was an intention to recapture some of what they feel Zelda had gotten away from in later installments in terms of the freedom and stuff, which we have seen as a big factor in this game now. Personally, from what they were saying, I don't think this is going to be a remake of the original game, especially when they were stressing... We didn't get any information about the story, but they were stressing story a lot. And what they have stressed, I don't see it going down that way. But it definitely will be interesting to see how the callbacks, what that means and how much it's just a wink and a nod, or if there's more direct and significant ties, especially when the original game is so story light. Do you have any thoughts really about where those are standing in respect of each other at the moment?
I mean, I personally still expect that it is going to have a heavy focus on story, despite how open world it is and how much freedom you have. I do expect it to be a focus, but interestingly, in the trailer, a lot of what we would consider to be the story staples of Zelda are absent in the trailer. So it does seem like, for the time being, Nintendo at least wants to create the image that there's a distance between what's come before and what's happening here too. So I guess it's one of those things. We'll have to wait and see. We haven't seen Zelda yet, as far as I know. And Ganondorf we haven't seen. He might not be in it. You know, he doesn't always have to appear, but it's one of those things, I guess, it's still unknown.
Yeah, and in terms of just the story of this game as opposed to how it's tying into others, Nintendo were talking that it's definitely a significant factor. And what was interesting is Aonuma was talking about what had been removed from the E3 demo. And he said that villages were specifically removed from the E3 demo, but they are there. But he didn't want players at E3 to be able to go into the villages for story reasons, which is very interesting that even just the first villages will have such a significant giveaway in terms of the story of this game. It does really make me wonder where it's going. We've already seen, you know, a much more technological aspect to this game. So it's going to be very interesting to see how that unfolds. I do think they're going for a different direction in terms of how the story is going to be delivered to you from before. But I am very curious what the story is going to be, because it also seems like it's going to be something we've not really seen Zelda tackle before. So what other takeaways did you really have from the game, really?
On the whole, I loved it. I think one thing we haven't spoken about, but I think deserves a mention, is the visual style and how beautiful the game actually is. And they did assure that was running on the Wii U. So it was really good to see that. They have said that the NX version will have graphical changes, that it will be superior to the Wii U version. But from what we saw at E3, the Wii U version does look great. So that's one thing I loved. I did have some concerns about the overworld being a bit empty, but with the assurances from Nintendo that, you know, villages are there and were just cut out, it does negate those fears a bit. So on the whole, I think it was one of the absolute best games from E3. I don't think there's any doubt about that. I think it was at least in the top 2. So I'm really optimistic about the game. I think it's going to be one of the best games in the franchise.
Yeah, I agree, and especially given the visual style. And something else that did catch me was how different the music direction was for this game in terms of the overworld. In terms of dungeon, it was kind of what we'd always known, but the overworld was much more music light and much more environmental sounds coming together to kind of almost build a rhythm. And it was quite calming, and I thought it was very good. Like, the sound effect direction in this game was really spot on and quite impressed me. One final thing I do want to draw attention to before we close is the combat in this game looks to be a little different as well. From what we've seen, it has something akin to Witch Time from the Bayonetta series, which is interesting for Zelda to tackle. You know, we saw that in I think the very, very first tease we got of the game, where he pulls out the bow and it slows down. At the time, that just looked to be stressing, you know, the new bow. But as you've seen in the game now, no, it's actually a gameplay feature, and it extends to more than just the bow. Even in combat, you know, if you, I think it was dodges, but it might have been parries. I can't remember exactly offhand, but there was something that if you do with the exact right timing, it will give you a sort of witch time-like effect, is what we've seen in Bayonetta, and enemies will just be slowed, and it will allow you to pile in a lot of hits to them, which again is different for Zelda. It's something we've seen in other games, but it's quite different when Zelda is approaching something like that, given how its combat works, as opposed to something like Bayonetta. Do you have any takeaways from that, really, or?
Yeah, I think it's going to be interesting to see how that factors in. It is one of a list of elements in the game that I do think shows that, to a degree, Nintendo was influenced by other games in the industry in recent times. Not that that's a bad thing, and the positive is that Nintendo has implemented some of them, but in a way that does still feel very Zelda, and it feels faithful to what Zelda is. So I have no qualms with that. It's definitely a positive.
Yeah, and especially when a lot of people have been feeling like Zelda has been a bit stuck in its ways. Influence isn't necessarily a bad thing if it helps expand the games out and really make it feel fresh in a way people have been looking for. So that was our thoughts for Zelda Breath of the Wild. Let us know what you thought below. Like, comment, and subscribe.